Hello, everybody. I'm the 100 Proof News Hound, here with another edition of the 100 Years and More Show. This is one of our special editions. It's not one of the monthly ones. This is one where we take an actual topic and examine it through the lens of newspapers, as the newspapers covered it at the time. Today may actually be the most important, fascinating, and interesting major true crime story that nobody in America knows anything about. There was a best-selling novel a dozen years back that dealt with it, but unless you read that book, it's hard to find anything about this particular story anywhere. We're going back 1905, 1913. It's the Los Angeles Times bombing. The actual building, the facilities of the Los Angeles Times were bombed in 1910, resulting in great loss of life. And that's what we'll be covering today. It's hard to believe that this story has not been made into a major motion picture. There is a reason for that, though, and that is that we've got the wrong good guys and the wrong bad guys. We're dealing here with a story of labor relations, employment law, true crime, dynamite. And in any story involving labor and management, if you know anything about Hollywood over the last 100 years or so, labor is always the good guy. Management is always the heavy. If the roles had been reversed, if the bad guy here was management and the good guy was labor, then this thing would have been made into a movie in the 1970s starring Sally Field and Jack Lemmon, directed by Warren Beatty. But it wasn't. And it wasn't because the bad guy in this story is labor. It's the unions, they in this particular case they're truly bad guys. Now that's not to say there's not lots of instances in American labor relations where the bad guys were in fact management. That goes without saying, steel industry, auto industry. But in this particular case, in this particular situation, the bad guys are the union, and actually a very specific union. It is the International Association of Bridge and Structural Iron Workers. Hereinafter, we'll refer to them as the union. In one 5-year span from 1905 to 1910, they actually were responsible for 110 bombings of buildings, facilities, construction sites, with a significant loss of life. It's been referred to as the largest domestic terror campaign in U.S. history, and was all part of the drive to unionize the steel industry from coast to coast. Now, some examples of the terror that went on during this period of time are, as follows. In the Lincoln Journal-Star, March 25th, 1908, damage to bridge by suspicious explosion. The new bridge of the Pennsylvania Railroad over the Raritan River was badly damaged early today by a dynamite explosion. Non-union men were employed on the work, and the police are endeavoring to see if there were any connection between this and the fact of the explosion. Now, of course, it was. Then, in 1909, the Larimer County Independent of Fort Collins, Colorado notes, Detroit, Michigan, a dozen residents in homes adjoining the establishment of the Zeitz Automobile and Transmission Company were tumbled from their beds at an early hour this morning when a satchel filled with dynamite exploded at the door of the automobile works. 2 persons received injuries. The dynamite was placed under a pile of iron castings. Then it explains the relationship between Zeitz and the unions. The Zeitz company is an open shop, and the castings were being made for use on the new federal building where non-union labor is employed. It is believed the explosion was intended to reach workmen of the day shift as they entered the building, but the hour was too early. Then, October 26, 1909, conspiracy is charged. Chattanooga Daily Times. Indianapolis police talk of dynamite explosion. Say labor unions are after contractors. And then they detailed what went on. Investigation of dynamite that wrecked buildings in different parts of the city last midnight had satisfied him that they were brought about by a carefully organized and skillfully executed conspiracy by enemies of Albert von Spreckelsen. Hard to believe that Albert von Spreckelsen had enemies, but apparently did. He's a building contractor in revenge for his having employed non-union labor. Shows you how good these guys are, the bomb experts. The 4 explosions occurred within 1 minute of each other, and evidently the dynamite had been set off by accurately prepared time fuses. Now, you'll see that in the LA the LA explosions as well. They're using the same type of delayed fuses. Los Angeles Times, September 5th, 1910. Now, this is 3.5 weeks before the explosion in Los Angeles, but here's how it's being covered by the general labor situation is being covered by the LA Times. Dynamiters blow up big non-union plant. 3 explosions reduce immense shops of Peoria concerned to kindling wood. Dynamiters at 10:30 tonight blew up and completely demolished the Lucas Bridge and Iron Company's immense plant in this city. 3 explosions reduced the building to kindling wood, and 4 buildings adjacent to the property were wrecked. The night watchman was seriously injured. It's the second disastrous explosion to occur within a few months, the other being the dynamiting of the new Peoria and Pekin Railroad Bridge. So they're blowing up bridges, they're blowing up factories, they're blowing up construction sites. And of course, the Lucas Company has been operating an open shop, meaning you don't have to join a union to be employed, but can give no reason for the attempt to destroy the plant. Well, obviously, that was the reason here. Now, this is an obvious case for the FBI in modern parlance. The problem is that the FBI didn't exist in 1910. And in fact, there was really no nationwide law enforcement agency that could investigate something like this. Each jurisdiction was left to their own devices, and we're going to see that even getting an accused from one jurisdiction to another is difficult because each individual state acted as if it was its own country, and so extradition was extremely difficult. Hard to enforce laws coast to coast. Now that the employers were blameless on this, everyone played pretty much hardball here. This is a story 2 weeks before the explosion up by the Los Angeles Times, and it's commenting on the state of union affairs as it relates to the iron industry and the oil industry. Headline: Retribution, make union brutes flee, drive bruisers from San Luis Obispo. Perpetrators of violence are thoroughly stung. After being pretty thoroughly whipped in Los Angeles and having had most of their talented strong-arm men either put in jail or driven out of town, the union labor gang seemed to have transferred temporarily the scene of its activity to San Luis Obispo. It looks like the union had thugs. It also looks like the employers had thugs. Although it's one step below that movie with George Clooney, Michael Clayton. If you will recall, George Clooney plays a lawyer that gets on the bad side of Big Pharma, and Big Pharma then just dispenses their hit squads, because all big American corporations have hitmen on call. If you recall that when they were called at the golf course and then told to go and whack Clooney. Now, why are they having all this problem with the unions in Los Angeles? The contracts are for the erection of the tanks and pumping plants, and they've been let to 3 Los Angeles firms, the Llewellyn Iron Works, the Western Pipe and Steel Company, and the Lacey Manufacturing Company, which are employing several hundred Los Angeles men, non-union guys. And the Llewellyn Company is important. That comes into play later. It gets bombed, and it's part of our story here. It's noted here, they have a way of turning phrases in newspapers 100 years ago. No real violence was attempted until Sunday night when a bunch of so-called pickets caught 3 of Llewellyn's men in the dark on the San Luis Obispo Road. The workmen were set upon by a greatly superior number of pickets and cruelly beaten. A couple other notes here right before. September 17th, 1910. Our bombing is going to take place on October 1st, so 2 weeks earlier. Dynamite, Chicago plant. Police connect strikers with terrible explosion. An explosion which the police believe was caused by dynamite as a result of labor troubles wrecked a portion of the plant of the Winslow Brothers Manufacturing Company. The force of the explosion was so great that 35 windows in the front of the structures were shattered. The heavy oak doors were split like kindling wood. And then finally, just days before our story's explosion, on September 27th, 1910, the LA Times notes, union laborites are now making concerted attacks on the oil fields, which are being furnished with material from Los Angeles ironworks. So we've got violence going back and forth between the steel industry, between the unions of the steel industry and the employers. Now, we've got an explosion happening here on October 1, 1910. Let me give you what we know. I'm going to give you the whole story here relating to the situation, and here we go. There are 3 fellows whose names are going to come up here. John J. McNamara. We'll call him JJ. They called him that in the press. James B. McNamara, JB, that's his brother. John McNamara is the secretary-treasurer of the union. James McNamara, JB McNamara, is basically the man in the field. He's the man of action with respect to the union. And one of the interesting things about these 2 gentlemen, and one of the reasons that they were able to avoid suspicion for so long in this series of crimes is they don't look like criminals. These two brothers actually look like they should be on daytime TV in a soap opera. These are really well-dressed, good-looking guys, and they just didn't appear to be the kind of guys who would do this kind of work, but they were. Now, what happened on September 30th is JB had been in town for a couple days in Los Angeles, checked into a hotel on the night of the 30th, before midnight. He leaves 18 sticks of dynamite in a satchel in the alley behind the LA Times building. He's using a mechanical clock to detonate them, like a real alarm clock, and it's set to go off at 1 a.m. He's also set similar bombs in front of the residence of the publisher of the LA Times, as well as the home of the head of the Merchants Manufacturers Association. So he's hoping at 1 o'clock to have 3 separate bombings. Interestingly enough, though, the bombs at the 2 residences don't go off, and the police determined they didn't go off because he'd wound the mainspring too tight, and it couldn't get any travel, and therefore the clock itself wasn't working, and fortunately those 2 bombs did not go off. Now, before 1 a.m., he gets on a train to San Francisco, so he's out of town when the explosions actually occur. The explosion will kill 21 people, injuring more than 150 of them, 50 of them seriously. The third person that we need to know is Mr. McManigal. Mr. McManigal is an employee of the union whose job basically is to set these explosions around the country, and his last one will be at the Llewellyn Iron Works. That explosion 5 weeks after this explosion will destroy the plant. Here's how the explosions were covered by the local papers. The Los Angeles Herald, Saturday, October 1st, in their first edition, explosion destroys Time Building, 30 thought dead. In the second edition, flames follow mighty blast, destroying newspaper home and blotting out many lives. List of missing gives clues to identity of dead. About 100 persons in building when the crash came at 1 a.m. Many injured making escapes. And they actually list as many people as they could with by occupation and the injuries that they received, such as E.B. Aspinall, linotype operator, cut over left eye, nose cut, wrist strained, minor injuries. U.S.G. Pence, linotype operator, jumped from window, wrist broken. Mrs. J.B. Ulrich fell down elevator shaft. Doesn't list her injuries, but it's hard to imagine that they weren't serious. And then finally, Charles E. Lovelace of the editorial staff jumped from the 3rd floor window, injuries perhaps fatal. With respect to the blast itself, they note, an explosion that shook the ground within a radius of half a mile wrecked the Times building at 1st Street and Broadway at 1:07 this morning, sending a sheet of flame high in the air and wrecking the structure. Fully a score of lives are now thought to have been lost. Probably 50 persons are seriously injured, and the property damage will exceed $500,000. Almost immediately following explosions, flames mounted high in the air, and within a few seconds, the entire building was ablaze. You're going to see that more people were burned to death than were hurt in the explosion. So quickly did the flames spread that the men on the 2nd and 3rd floors were cut off from any avenue of escape, and many hurled themselves to the pavement to avoid being burned alive. Later that same day, in a further edition, mysterious explosion followed by flames destroys Times building. Most of the injured jumped from windows to the pavement 15 feet below. Some suffered fractured limbs, while others escaped injury, but were seriously burned in dashing through the flames to their only avenue of escape. It's noted that many remained behind to assist those who were caught in more dangerous position. Then, when the flames were leaping up through the 3rd floor, a wild rush was made for the windows in the tower at the corner of the building. Several were unable to reach the apertures, but were seen to stagger forward and fall backward into the seething furnace. Others, more fortunate, reached the windows, but before they could jump to the hard pavement below, fell into the pit when the floor beneath them gave way. So there's a tower in the building. They managed to make it to the tower, but before they can get out the windows, the floor collapses and down they go. Headline, firemen tried to flood the building. The firemen bent their efforts toward flooding the part of the building on the 3rd floor where persons were supposed to have made their last stand. Lines of those were strung from all nearby plugs, and streams forced by every fire engine in the city were spraying the burning building, trying to give them some relief. There's some terrible tales here of individual situations. Let me just give you one here. I tried to grab the girl, but a crowd joined us from behind, and I could not reach her. In going down the fire escape, a young man who looked like a pressman and who was covered with oil fainted across my back. And I turned and grabbed his arm, but the flesh came off with the cloth of his shirt, and it sickened me. I let him go. This fellow and the girl, I am positive, both perished. One man occupied a position at a window around which the flames were wreathing. The heat was intense, and his smoked face and blazed garments presented a picture of utter despair. A ladder was placed to the wall directly beneath him, but before the firemen could reach him, The victim dropped limply out of the window and crashed to the ground. Willing men rushed to his assistance and dragged him from where the flames swirled in maddening fury. Few escaped injury. Every man who fled from the building was burned, bruised, cut, or maimed. A fireman was seriously injured, perhaps fatally. Well, he was responding with the one of the first hoses, and a portion of the wall collapsed, burying him. They dug him out. However, a steel I-beam was across his legs, which weighed several thousand pounds. It took 2.5 hours to extricate them, but he lost the foot, and at the time of printing, they didn't know whether he'd live or not. It was speculated that nothing but a great quantity of dynamite or several quarts of nitroglycerin could have caused the terrible upheaval. Now, interesting, the LA Times, one of America's great newspapers, at least it pretends to be now, but one of America's great newspapers, was not off print for long. As a matter of fact, headline, undaunted, bombs burst, but the Times goes marching on. This is the Los Angeles Times edition of Sunday, October the 2nd. So I only missed one edition. Within 2 hours after the building had been blown up by the labor union assassins, the daily issue containing vivid reports of outrage were presented. They had an auxiliary plant that had been under construction, and they transferred all production to the auxiliary plant, and they actually got an addition out before the end of the day. It's noted that the Times has every facility for promptly and officially publishing the paper without the loss of a single day. No, that is no idle boast, and it is attested to the fact that yesterday's edition of the Times was out within a few hours of the disaster. And they went on to say that they could produce 48,000 papers per hour at the supplemental plant. Now, we've got a bombing, and we suspect who did it, but investigating multi-jurisdictional conspiracy crimes is beyond the scope of any individual police department at that time. So what did the mayor of Los Angeles do? Well, he hired the best detective company in the country, which he thought to be the Burns Detective Agency under the supervision of William J. Burns. And it turns out that William J. Burns had been conducting for several years a nationwide investigation of just this situation. He'd been hired by the Employers Association, and he actually had plants within the union itself, including union board member Herbert S. Hawkins. So he was actually would sit in on board of directors meetings. So they sort of knew where this was going, even in the early hours after the explosion. Hawkins told Burns that McManigal was in charge of the day-to-day bombing campaign, and he took orders from Frank Ryan, the president of the union, as well as Secretary-Treasurer J.J. McNamara, and he was assisted by J.B. McNamara in logistics. On April 14th, 1911, so 6 months after the incident, Burns arrested McManigal and J.B. McNamara at a hotel in Detroit. They were tracked to the hotel in Detroit, and when they were arrested, they didn't tell them they were investigating the bombing. They told them they were investigating a robbery in Chicago. And since neither one had robbed anybody in Chicago, their guard was down, and they were taken into custody. They were actually held. They were held in a home in the Chicago area for about a week. Totally, if not outright illegal, certainly inappropriate. Burns told McManigal that he had the goods on him for the series of bombings, and promised him a lighter sentence if he would cooperate. And cooperate he did. And actually, by the end of this saga, McManigal will be convicted, but sentenced to only 2.5 years in prison, and which, given the magnitude of his crimes, as we will describe here, was quite a deal for him. Now, McManigal fingered J.B. as the perpetrator of the LA Times bombing, and said that the board of the union not only was aware of the bombings, but they had in fact ordered them, including the aforementioned Llewellyn Iron and Bridge explosion that took place 5 weeks after the LA Times explosion. Now, all of the three fellows that have been arrested, the two McNamara brothers as well as McManigal, are put on a train, and they arrive in Los Angeles 3 days later. But this case has got lots of twists and turns. Burns and his associates, which included the assistant district attorney of LA County, as well as his chauffeur, are arrested back in Indiana and released under $10,000 bonds on kidnapping charges, on a charge that had been preferred by a affidavit submitted by Ryan, the president of the union. Now, they're arrested, they post bond, and that eventually all goes away. I don't think any district attorney in Indiana wanted to be involved with representing the interests of a murderous trade union, let's say, and those charges are eventually dropped, and all the action then transfers out to Los Angeles. Now, we've noticed this in several other episodes. There is much more access to criminals back by the press back in the early 1900s. McManigal, for some reason, starts talking to a reporter for the Buffalo News. And headline in the Buffalo News, April 25th, 1911, McManigal admits blowing up Buffalo viaducts. Reported dynamiter partially repeats his confession to the News, admits explosions were the work of a gang. We've got the right men. In response to the McManigal disclosure to the newspaper, Burns notes, "We've got the right men," Detective Burns says. "Our case is complete," declares W.J. Burns. And he summarizes the evidence that he has, including evidence from the hotel front desk clerk where J.B. McNamara had stayed, as well as from Dynamite Supply House, where, when presented with pictures of J.B. Burns, the clerk was able to make the determination that was in fact Mr. Davis, same Mr. Davis who had bought dynamite from him a few days before. Burns notes, "This is the most astounding, widespread, cold-blooded, and disastrous conspiracy to destroy property and human lives ever exposed in the United States. I can assure the public that only the stern demands of justice and the good of the public has guided me in pointing the finger of condemnation at these labor leaders." McManigal continued to talk to the press. He stated in an article, April 25th, 1911, that he declared that he'd been paid for the innumerable dynamite jobs he is charged with at the rate of $200 each, so that's about $6,000 each, plus his expenses, and that he had been kept busy. That he said that he was not in Los Angeles at the time of the Times disaster, but charged that James Bryce McNamara touched off the bomb which destroyed the Los Angeles Times building and caused the loss of 21 lives. McManigal declared John J. McNamara, James' brother, to be the brains of the gang, and he admitted to the explosions in Buffalo and said that he'd been responsible for more than 50 similar disasters over the previous few years. Now, the character of Burns, while it hasn't been put into question, there's an interesting article that appeared in the Ocala Evening Star in Ocala, Florida on April 28th under the headline, "Burns Can't Be Bribed. Successful Career of the Sleuth Who Was Stacking Up Evidence Against McNamara and His Friends." It's noted that long before he became head of the private agency which now bears his name and was awarded the contract for the detective work of the American Bankers Association, he had proved himself the shrewdest of all expert men in the service of Uncle Sam. So he'd been a detective in the Secret Service before going out on his own. And he was famous for having been hired to investigate corruption in San Francisco. And with respect to that, it is noted, what Burns did in San Francisco will never be forgotten there. It was on evidence he obtained that Abe Roof, the boss, was sent to jail together with Mayor Schmertz and other municipal officers. Repeated efforts were made to bribe Burns when he got close to the guilty. An offer of $100,000 was made to him, which he scornfully rejected. Don't know whether that's true or not, but that's like $3 million. Then the offer was made in a more subtle manner, in such a way that there was no possibility that the receipt of the bribe would ever be exposed. Burns was not to be corrupted. The would-be bribers came away wondering, this kind of man was new to their experience. Well, he's got a good reputation, I guess. This is where we go to, I guess we'd call it the second act of our movie. The first act is the conspiracy to bomb, and then the actual bombings, and the union machinations with the employers, all of that. The second aspect of this is the trial, and the trial is bizarre. You're going to see it. Not only does it result in convictions for the defendants, it almost results in convictions of the defense lawyer. Now, let's go. Who is the defense lawyer? Well, they wanted to hire the best defense lawyer they could. So the ironworkers went out and tried to hire Clarence Darrow. Clarence Darrow, working out of Chicago, was not really interested in the case. He really wasn't. So he threw out a big number, a stupid big number. He said he needed $350,000 to do this trial. $350,000 is a better part of $10 million. Crazily enough, the union said, okay, they passed the hat amongst the union members. They came up with $350,000, and Darrow couldn't turn it down. But when he went to L.A., the more he spoke to the witnesses and the more he spoke to the accused, the less he liked the case. He thought that this thing was going to end up in convictions and death sentences for these guys here. So Darrow became more inclined to start looking towards cutting a plea deal here. But in any event, there was a as I said earlier, the press gets exposed. The press gets exposure to the defendants that would never happen today. In one insane move, the McNamaras were interviewed by an aggressive journalist named Lincoln Steffens. Steffens told Darrow that the boys had confessed to him. Now, a defense lawyer never wants to hear his client tell him that he's committed the act, because that means that ethically he can't put the man on the stand. You can't put somebody up there you know is going to perjure himself. So when he hears that, Darrow's been put into a real hard situation. He was already leaning towards cutting a deal, but this really forces him to really work hard to get a plea deal in this situation. He talks to the district attorney, and he talks to the LA Times. The owner of the Times has a vested interest in the case because it's his employees and his building, which was destroyed by the bombers. The lawyers for the Los Angeles Times talk to Darrow, and they work out a deal whereby the union agrees to stop all strikes and to actually stop all union building activity in the state of California in exchange for very light sentences with respect to both McNamaras. However, that particular deal goes sideways when the district attorney basically accuses them of being nuts and says, "Well, I'm not doing anything unless JB McNamara is given a life sentence, not a light sentence." And they agree in principle on that JB McNamara will go to jail for life. But while they're finalizing the plea deal with respect to the McNamaras and the McManagles, all hell breaks loose. Headline: Fall River Globe, Fall River, Massachusetts, November 29, 1911. McNamara sleuth is accused of bribery, charged with tampering the prospective jurors in noted case. Turns out, at the exact same time that they're negotiating the plea deal, somebody, and the somebody has to be Darrow, you would think, unless it's a frame job, is trying to bribe one of the jurors. For multiple thousands of dollars to throw the case. However, the three men were caught on a street corner before two of them could take their hands out of their pockets after it was alleged they had stuffed money in them. So hands in pockets, the men were marched to the Hall of Records where District Attorney Fred waited for them. When their hands came out of their pockets, Brown declared they were full of bills. So they went to the district attorney had all of the Darrow men under surveillance, and they actually had a fellow posing as a motorcycle rider fixing his motorcycle on a street corner near Darrow's office. And as fate would have it, the agent of Darrow, the private investigator, and one of his associates met with the juror on that street corner, 3 feet away from the district attorney's investigator. And as they were exchanging the money, with money in hand and money in pockets, they were arrested. Darrow denied any involvement in the bribery, and he said, "I will say that no money has been used by the defense in the manner charged, and I believe that the whole affair will be cleared up." Well, it got cleared up, but only after 2 trials. We'll get to them in a second. The plea deal that Darrow was working on with the district attorney went through. McNamara got life in prison. John Jay, the secretary of treasurer of the union, got 15 years, and McManigal eventually only served 2.5 years for his crimes. Now, there's some interesting words with respect to the sentencing. Los Angeles Evening Post, December 5th, 1911. Sentence imposed on 2 confessed dynamiters by Judge Walter Bordwell. Last act of remarkable trial staged in little courtroom in Hall of Justice. And it is noted that there is no comfort in the assertion that you did not intend to take human life. James B. McNamara, you are a murderer at heart and well deserving of the gallows, but in view of the recommendations of the state, the judgment of the court in your case is that you are to be confined in the state prison at San Quentin for the balance of your natural life. The sentences were carried out. James J. McNamara would be out in less than his 15 years, and he would actually go on to a continuing successful union career. This was just an impediment that J.B. McNamara, though, would die in prison. Now, That gets us to Darrow. Darrow was charged in jury tampering in both cases. Both the case against J.J. McNamara and J.B. McNamara, so there's actually 2 trials. Those trials take place in August. The first trial concludes in August of 1912. It began in May of 1912 and continued throughout the 3 months. 38 witnesses were called by the defense, 50 witnesses called by the prosecution. Darrow himself spent a week on the stand. It took 4 days for rebuttal evidence, and just charging the jury took over an hour. Jury came back in 34 minutes. Not guilty is Darrow verdict. Jury makes such report after brief deliberation, literally 34 minutes. They were back there, and he was acquitted on the first charge. The theory was, and it made some sense, Darrow was saying, why would I be bribing a juror where I'm at that exact moment finalizing the plea bargain case? I'm finalizing the thing by way of a plea bargain. Why am I bribing jurors? I'm being set up by the district attorney. The district attorney said, why would we be setting up a Darrow when we're working on a plea bargain? So it cut both ways, but that created enough confusion in the juror's mind that it only took them 34 minutes to acquit. The second trial continued, though. They had a second trial. Didn't last as long as the first trial, but it came back with a hung jury. It was hung 8-4 in favor of conviction. And the prosecutor set the jury comes back March 9th, 1913, and they set March 31 as the date to begin a retrial. So are they going to have a retrial of this thing or not? Nah, everyone was tired of the whole thing. A conviction for Darrow would have ruined his career. What he agreed was to give up his law license in the state of California, never practice law in California again. So that brings us full circle on this most interesting case. We've got bombings and bribery and destruction on a monumental scale. It's a tale that is virtually unknown by the American public. Like I said at the beginning, it's virtually unknown because the wrong guys are the bad guys in this particular instance. Now, that brings us to our drink of the week. Well, the cocktail of the week here couldn't be more appropriate. We've got dynamite bombings aplenty. So we're gonna go for a TNT. Now the TNT is tequila and tonic. What we're gonna do, it's 2 ounces of tequila and 6 ounces of tonic. Fill a highball glass with ice. Pour your tequila in first, and this is important. You always want to pour the spirit in before the sweetener. You always want to pour in the spirit because it's lighter. If you pour your mixer in first and then your spirit, the spirit has a tendency to stay on top, and you'll end up with a harsh drink up top. By pouring at the bottom, the natural weight of the tequila will bring it to the top. A slight swizzle is all you really need to do here. You want as much carbonation to remain in the drink as possible. You would garnish this with a lime wedge, and it is an excellent alternative to a gin and tonic. Equally refreshing, but with that little bit of Southern Mexican flavor. So there we are. Olivia, maybe you can play us out here with a little music. Oh, and please like and subscribe. If you've made it this far, you've already done it, right? Okay, take care, everybody.